My father-in-law looked at me across his mahogany desk and said, "The company your wife helped build is worth $12 million today. Sign the separation agreement, walk away with 2, and we'll call it even." He slid the folder across like he was tipping a valet. Not even eye contact. Just the folder. And the assumption that I'd take it. I picked up the pen. I read every page slowly. Then I signed my name on every line he'd highlighted and slid it back. "Thank you," I said. "Give my best to the family." He blinked. He'd expected negotiation, maybe tears. What he got was a man who had already done his math 3 months ago. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 4 years building something real, and the people closest to me spent the last 8 months trying to figure out how to take it without me noticing. They almost pulled it off. Almost. I was 29 when I married her. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel like an event. Smart, quick, the type who remembered your coffee order and your mother's birthday. Her family had old money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself. Her father ran a logistics firm that had been in the family since the 80s. Her mother chaired 2 nonprofits and wore it like jewelry. They were polished in a way that made you feel slightly underdressed even when you weren't. I was a software engineer from Columbus, Ohio. No family name, no dynasty. Just a mind that liked solving problems and a work ethic my father had drilled into me before he passed. My wife and I met at a conference in Austin. She was there, representing her father's firm. I was there pitching a routing optimization platform I'd spent 18 months building in a studio apartment. We talked for 4 hours at the hotel bar. By the time I flew home, I had her number, a potential investor lead, and the strange certainty that my life had just changed lanes. We were married 14 months later. The business grew fast once we combined resources. Her family's network opened doors I'd have spent years knocking on. My platform solved a problem their industry had been duct taping over for decades. Within 2 years, we had 7 enterprise clients, a small team, and a valuation that made her father stop looking at me like I was an interesting hobby she'd brought home. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't piece together until much later, was that her father had been watching all of it like a chess player waiting for the right moment to swap pieces. The first sign I missed was the lawyer. About a year into the business, my wife suggested we bring on a corporate attorney to clean up our operating agreements. She recommended someone. A man named Garrett who billed $300 an hour and had offices on the 42nd floor of a building downtown. I said fine, made sense, we needed proper documentation. Garrett came in, reviewed everything, made a few suggestions and departed efficiently. I didn't know until much later that Garrett had been her father's attorney for 11 years. The second sign was the IP filing. In the chaos of scaling, I'd leaned on my wife to help manage administrative tasks. She had an eye for process, and I trusted her completely. At some point, she handled a set of patent continuation filings on my behalf, documents I drafted, signatures I thought were mine, filed under a holding company I'd never heard of. I found out about the holding company by accident. 7 months before the day her father slid that folder across his desk, I was looking for a specific contract amendment in our shared drive and clicked the wrong folder. Inside was a subfolder labeled with a name I didn't recognize. A Delaware LLC, 2 years old, registered to an address I'd never seen. My wife was listed as the primary member. The IP filings inside were for my platform's core architecture. I closed the folder. I went for a walk. I didn't say a word. For the next 6 weeks, I was very quiet and very busy. I hired my own attorney. Not someone in her orbit. A woman named Carol out of Chicago who specialized in intellectual property disputes and had a reputation for being methodical and unimpressed by wealth. I gave her everything I had, every original file, every time-stamped version of my code repository, every email thread going back to the founding of the company. I explained what I'd found. She went to work. What Carol found was worse than I'd expected and exactly what I'd feared. The holding company had been set up 9 months after our wedding. The IP filings had been submitted using my signature on documents I had signed in a different context, reused without my knowledge. There were internal emails between my wife, Garrett, and her father discussing the strategy in language that was careful but not careful enough once you knew what you were looking at. The plan was simple. Once the platform hit a certain valuation, they would surface the holding company as the true IP owner, negotiate a licensing deal that would effectively price me out of my own company, or offer me a buyout that sounded generous until you understood I was being bought out of something I'd already built. I read Carol's summary on a Tuesday evening at a coffee shop 3 blocks from our apartment. I ordered a second cup and read it again. Then I sat back and thought about the woman I'd married, and whether any of it had been real, and decided that question didn't help me right now. What helped me was the step Carol had already taken on my instruction 2 weeks earlier. We had filed our own IP registration, separate from the holding company, using my original timestamp source code as prior art, submitted through a different channel, assigned to a clean holding entity I'd set up in my name only. We had also filed a confidential fraud complaint with the state attorney's office, attaching the documentation as exhibits. Everything was in place. The meeting with her father, the one with the folder, came 10 days later. He called it a family conversation. I sat across from him in that office full of dark wood and framed photographs and let him make his offer. He was expecting a wounded man. He got a man who had already moved the pieces. I signed the separation agreement because it was carefully worded to address the marriage, not the business. Carol had read it 3 times. There was nothing in it that touched the IP dispute we had already filed separately. Her father didn't know about that filing. He thought he was closing a chapter. He was actually just starting one. I flew to Reykjavik that Thursday. I'd booked the trip 6 weeks earlier, right after that walk I'd taken when I found the folder. I needed somewhere that felt nothing like my life for a few days. Iceland in March is cold and gray and completely indifferent to your problems, which is exactly what I wanted. I was standing on a black sand beach watching the Atlantic push itself against the shore when Carol called. "They've been served," she said. I didn't say anything for a moment. The wind was loud enough that I had to cup my hand over the phone. "How did they take it?" Garrett called me within 20 minutes. His tone was instructive. I asked her what she meant. "He was panicking," she said. "Politely, but panicking. Here is what had happened. The same evening I boarded my flight, Carol's office had filed a formal IP theft claim against the holding company, against Garrett personally for facilitating document fraud, and against my father-in-law's logistics firm, which had been quietly listed as a secondary beneficiary of the contested IP rights. The claim was supported by 73 pages of documented evidence including the original source code timestamps, the reused signature comparison analysis, and the internal emails that Garrett had been sloppy enough to send from his firm's server rather than a personal account. What none of them had calculated was the timing. My father-in-law was in the middle of a $40 million acquisition of a regional freight company. The deal was supposed to close in 11 days. The buyer's legal team, doing routine due diligence, found the active IP fraud claim in public filings the morning after it was submitted. They called my father-in-law's office to ask for clarification. He didn't have any. I stood on that beach for another hour. The sky was the color of a bruise. A single bird flew directly into the wind and held itself perfectly still. My wife called at 6 in the morning, local time. I was already awake, drinking coffee in the hotel room, watching the harbor. "You planned this," she said. No greeting. Her voice was flat in a way I hadn't heard before. "I responded to what you started," I said. "That's not what this is." "Then explain it to me." She was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "My father is going to lose the acquisition," she said finally. "I know. You're doing this on purpose. You filed patents using my signature on documents I never authorized. I'm correcting the record. It wasn't like that." I let that sentence sit there between us. She didn't add anything to it. "You should talk to your own attorney," I said. "Not Garrett. Someone who represents you and only you." I ended the call and finished my coffee. The acquisition fell through the next day. The freight company's board cited the unresolved legal exposure as grounds for withdrawal. $40 million, gone. The kind of deal that takes years to reassemble. Then the second thing happened, and this one I hadn't seen coming. During discovery in the IP case, Carol's team subpoenaed communication records from the holding company's formation period. Inside those records was a thread that had nothing to do with patents. It was between my wife and a man named Trevor, who was a product director at a firm I'll call a direct competitor of mine. The thread was long. Some of it was personal. More of it was professional in a way that it absolutely should not have been. She had been sharing internal development roadmaps with him. Quarterly strategy documents, hiring pipeline data. Specific architectural decisions I'd made months before implementing them that had somehow shown up in a competitor product release 6 weeks later. The thread went back 22 months. So there it was. Not just the IP filing, not just the holding company. She had been actively feeding information to a competitor, and the man receiving it was someone she'd been involved with for nearly 2 years of our marriage. I was in Chicago by then, staying at Carol's office guest suite because we were in the middle of intensive prep work. She came in with the printout and set it on the table without saying anything. I read through it. I read through it again. "This changes the scope," Carol said. "Yes," I said. "We can add tortious interference. Breach of fiduciary duty if we can establish she had any formal role." "She had a consulting agreement," I said. "We set it up in year 1. She drafted it." Carol wrote something in her notebook. "Then yes," she said. "This is significantly worse for them than it was yesterday. I went for another walk. Chicago in March is a different kind of cold than Iceland, pushier, more personal. I walked along the river for 40 minutes and thought about the first year of the marriage, the conference in Austin, the 4 hours at the hotel bar, the certainty I'd felt on the flight home. I let myself feel what I was actually feeling, which was grief, and I gave it exactly as much time as I was standing outside. And then I went back in. Her father called that evening. He didn't have the folder this time. Miles, he started and then caught himself. I'm sorry. I keep doing that. I don't know why. It's fine, I said. I let him collect himself. This has gone further than any of us intended, he said. Further than you intended, I replied. I intended exactly this. He was quiet. What do you want? He asked. It was a different question than it had been in his office. Less transactional. More tired. I want a full and unconditional assignment of all IP rights currently held by the holding company to my clean entity, I said. I want a signed acknowledgement of the fraud from Garrett's firm, which his malpractice insurer will want anyway. I want a settlement that covers Carol's fees and a number I'll let her specify. And I want your daughter's consulting agreement dissolved with a formal acknowledgement that all proprietary information she accessed during that period remains my property. He said nothing for a moment. And in return? I don't go forward with the criminal referral, I said. The Attorney General's office has the complaint but hasn't acted on it yet. I can request it be held pending settlement. But only if everything I just described is signed, witnessed, and filed within 30 days. He exhaled. She's my daughter, he said. I know that, I said. I'm not asking you to stop being her father. I'm asking you to stop being my opponent. The settlement was signed 19 days later. Carol sat across from Garrett and didn't smile once, which I think was deliberate and appreciated. My father-in-law aged visibly between the day in his office and the day in the conference room. That wasn't something I'd planned, and I didn't take satisfaction in it. He was a man who had miscalculated and was paying the price. I understood that feeling from the inside out. Garrett's firm paid Carol's fees and then some. The IP assignment was clean, airtight, filed the same afternoon. Every document my wife had sent to Trevor was cataloged and marked confidential, her consulting agreement voided with prejudice. Trevor, for his part, was quietly let go by his company 2 weeks later. Apparently, having documented evidence that a product director had received stolen development roadmaps from a competitor's spouse made his continued employment a liability the board wasn't interested in carrying. I flew back to Columbus on a Wednesday. I landed at 4 in the afternoon and drove to the office I hadn't been to in 6 weeks. My team was still there. They'd kept things running with the kind of quiet professionalism that makes you realize you hired well. I sat in the conference room with the 3 of them, my lead engineer, my operations manager, and the account executive who had closed 2 of our biggest clients, and I told them the truth. Not everything, but enough. I told them there had been a legal dispute over the company's IP and that it was resolved entirely in our favor. I told them nothing would change in their roles or equity agreements. I told them I was back and we were moving forward. My lead engineer said, "We figured something was up when you stopped answering emails at 7 a.m. The room laughed. So did I. In the months that followed, I rebuilt what needed rebuilding and cleared out what didn't. I removed every external advisory relationship that had come through my wife's network and replaced them with people I vetted independently. I renegotiated 2 client contracts that had been structured in ways that subtly limited my leverage. I added a head of legal who reported to no one but me. I also made one more change, the one that mattered most to me personally. The company had been operating under a name that my wife had suggested early on. A clean, professional name that meant nothing to anyone, including me. I'd always thought we'd rename it eventually when we had the momentum to make the new name land. We had that momentum now. I named it Meridian. Not after a person. Not after anything dramatic. Meridian because it means the highest point, but also because it's the line you cross. You're on one side of it or the other. I'd crossed mine. My wife and I finalized the divorce through attorneys. We didn't speak directly during that process. At the end of it, she sent me one message through her personal email, not her legal team. It said, "I hope you know I did care about you." I read it twice. I believed it, partially. In the way you can believe something is true and also understand that it wasn't enough to change what happened. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Because there was nothing useful left to say, and I'd learned by then that silence is not always coldness. Sometimes it's just clarity. A year later, Meridian closed a Series A that put us in a different category entirely. The investors were people who had found us, not the other way around, because the platform had gotten quiet word of mouth in the industry for being the most reliable routing solution in the market. We hadn't chased press. We hadn't done a launch event. We just built something that worked, and people talked. At the closing dinner for the Series A, one of the investors asked me how I'd managed to maintain focus through what he'd read had been a difficult period personally. I thought about the beach in Iceland, the walk along the river in Chicago, the morning I found that folder in the shared drive and went outside instead of saying anything. I stopped trying to predict other people, I said. I just stayed focused on what I could actually control. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer. It was also the only answer I had. I still live in Columbus. I own a house now, not an apartment, with a porch I use in the evenings when it's warm enough. My father grew up 3 neighborhoods over from where I live now, and sometimes when I drive that stretch of road I think about the things he told me when I was young, about doing the work, about not performing your wounds, about how the people who actually arrive somewhere are usually the ones who stopped waiting for permission. Carol came to the Series A dinner. She wore green and ordered the steak, and at some point during dessert leaned over and said, "You know, most clients call me panicking. You called me organized." I had time to think, I said. "You had a plan," she said. I smiled. I had a head start. She raised her glass and we clinked, and I looked around the room at the people who had bet on something I built, and I thought about a man on a black sand beach in Iceland listening to the Atlantic, deciding to be very quiet and very busy. That man had no idea how it would turn out. He just knew what he'd built, what he could prove, and what he wasn't willing to let go. It turned out to be enough. It always does. When the thing you're protecting is actually yours.